So there's this viral clip that's been making the rounds, and it's sparked a huge debate about American history with a pretty provocative argument. What we're going to do today is just break down exactly what that argument is. We'll look at the claims, the reasoning, everything presented in the original source.
Okay, so the whole argument really kicks off by tackling a huge, widespread belief about how the country was founded. It starts with this one big statement, that America is not, in fact, built on stolen land. And, that one idea, that's the real linchpin here. It's meant to grab you right away, challenge your assumptions, and basically set the stage for a completely different way of looking at history.
So, building on that initial, pretty bold challenge, the source frames its entire argument as what you could call a counternarrative. The idea here isn't just to offer, a slightly different take. The goal is to completely dismantle what it claims is the main story, the one we're all taught, and to argue that that story is just plain wrong.
And here it is, laid out in the clearest possible terms. The source basically says that the popular story we all know, the one about a country built on the oppression and subjugation of so-called indigenous people, is just not true. That's it. That's the central idea, the foundation that the entire rest of the argument is trying to support.
Okay, so to back up this huge counter-narrative, the argument takes a really interesting turn. It zooms in on one single, very, very charged word. The source is now going to try and justify why a term we see today as a deeply offensive slur was used back then.
And this is where the argument makes a really crucial move. It says that, today we're told that word, savage, was just pure bigotry and racism. But the argument argues, no, there was a reason for it. In fact, it claims that label was earned. The idea is that it was a description based on what people were doing, not on some kind of preconceived prejudice.
Now, for that line of reasoning to hold up, the source has to basically redefine the word savage itself. The argument frames it not as a racial slur, but as a behavioral descriptor, a term you could apply to anyone, from anywhere, who is engaging in these really brutal acts, like murder or even cannibalism.
Okay, so how do you support a claim like that? Well, the argument moves from just talking about words to what it calls hard evidence, pointing to specific archaeological findings that it claims prove a history of brutality, long before any Europeans arrived.
The cornerstone of its evidence is this, the claim of widespread pre-Columbian cannibalism. This is really the linchpin, because if true, it would establish a baseline of brutal behavior that's completely independent of any European influence.
And they don't just say it happened, they put a number on it. The source claims that anthropologists have found cannibalized human remains at 25 different archaeological sites, specifically in the American Southwest.
The timing here is everything, right? The source dates these remains from around 900 AD to 1300 AD. So the point they're making is that this was happening centuries before Columbus or any other European settlers ever set foot in the Americas. Then it gets really specific, laying out the forensic details that it says proves this was actually cannibalism. We're talking about things that suggest these weren't just victims of violence. The source points to butchering cut marks, skulls broken open, long bones smashed to get the marrow, and even evidence that the bones were burned or cooked and then thrown out with other food scraps.
All right, so after laying out all that physical evidence, the argument does a complete 180. It shifts from archaeology to, psychology. The source now uses this alleged history of brutality to ask for empathy, but specifically, empathy for the European settlers.
The main idea here is that we've been looking at history with a one-sided sense of empathy. The argument insists that to be fair, we have to try and shed our modern context and see this strange new world through the settler's eyes.
And wow, what a different perspective that is. According to the source, it argues that the settlers showed up without a lot of concepts we just assume are universal now, like a belief in human equality for all people. In this view, they were totally isolated. No maps, no history books, no context for what they were walking into.
To really drive this home, the source paints this very vivid picture. It basically asks you to imagine this. You get here and you encounter people who are running around naked or in loincloths, murdering each other brutally, and in some cases, eating each other. It's a picture designed to make you feel that shock and confusion.
And that all leads up to the argument's big challenge to you, the modern viewer. The source just puts it out there. If that was you in that exact situation, without any of our modern understanding, what conclusions would you draw? And maybe more importantly, what words would you use to describe what you were seeing? So in the final section, the source takes all these different threads, the counternarrative, the archaeology, the call for settler empathy, and weaves them together to form its final, overarching conclusion about American history.
First thing it does is say that this archaeological evidence just completely shatters that romantic, noble savage idea. The claim is that this idealized vision of a totally peaceful people just kind of melts away when you look at this evidence of brutality.
And once you throw out that narrative, the source reframes the entire mission of the settlers. From this viewpoint, they weren't destroying a civilization. Instead, they were trying to build a civilization where, the argument claims, one didn't really exist before.
And that leads to what is probably the most shocking claim in the whole argument. Looking at it this way, the source says that the European and American settlers actually showed a surprising and admirable lack of brutality. The idea is that their actions were pretty restrained, especially when you compare them to the violence that was allegedly already there.
And that, right there, is the argument in a nutshell. It's a chain of logic that starts with a really provocative statement, moves to archaeological claims, then asks for a shift in empathy, and it all ends up in this dramatic reinterpretation of the past. It really leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. How do the perspectives we choose to adopt really shape our entire understanding, not just of history, but of the world we live in right now?